the first time Roman Charles called me a nuisance. I was 9 years old, soaked from head to toe in pond water, and holding up a half-drowned frog like it was a trophy I'd earned with my life. "Get that thing away from me, Glenn," he said, except it wasn't really said so much as it was growled low and flat, the way only a 15-year-old alpha trying very hard to look unbothered in front of his best friend could growl. My brother Theo had laughed so hard he'd fallen backward off the dock. I remember the sound of that laugh better than I remember the frog, better than I remember the sting of pond water in my eyes. I remember Roman standing there, arms crossed, golden hair plastered to his forehead from where Theo had splashed him minutes earlier, looking at me like I was something that had crawled directly out of the mud to ruin his afternoon. "You're such a nuisance," he'd said again, quieter that time, like the words were something he was testing out, deciding if they fit. They fit. They fit so well that for the next 11 years, that word followed me around like a shadow that had learned to walk on 2 legs. Nuisance. It was what he called me when I tagged along on their bike rides and couldn't keep up. It was what he muttered when I interrupted their video game nights to ask if I could play too. It was the word he used the year I turned 13 and made the catastrophic decision to follow them into the woods behind our house because I didn't want to be left alone, and ended up twisting my ankle so badly that Roman had to carry me back on his shoulders, complaining the entire 2 miles about how I was the most inconvenient human being he had ever had the misfortune of being attached to by virtue of my brother's poor choice in friends. I used to lie awake some nights and turn that word over and over in my head, like I could wear the sharp edges off it if I touched it enough. Nuisance. Such a clinical, dismissive thing to be. Not hated. Not unwanted exactly. Just inconvenient. A fly that wouldn't stop buzzing around the room he was trying to occupy. I'm 20 now, he's 26. And 3 days ago, I came home for the first time in 2 years to find Roman Charles standing in my brother's kitchen wearing one of Theo's old t-shirts, looking like every single thing I had spent 2 years trying very hard to stop thinking about. He didn't call me a nuisance this time. He didn't call me anything at all. He just stood there with a coffee mug halfway to his mouth, eyes locking onto mine across the kitchen island, and for one suspended, terrifying second, neither of us said a single word. I want to tell you that story properly. I want to tell you how an 11-year habit of being someone's least favorite person turned into something I still don't have a name, for something that lives behind his ribs the same way it lives behind mine. Something neither of us has been brave enough to say out loud, but to understand how we got to that kitchen, to that silence, to the way his throat moved when he swallowed before he finally spoke my name like it cost him something. You have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand what it's like to grow up as the unwanted shadow of 2 boys who became men right in front of you. Men whose friendship was a closed door you spent your whole childhood standing outside of, knocking. My parents had Theo first, and Theo was everything an alpha family wanted in a firstborn. Broad-shouldered even as a child, quick to laugh, quicker to defend. The kind of boy who got invited to every birthday party in our neighborhood before he was even old enough to remember most of their names. I came 4 years later, an omega, smaller, quieter, the kind of child people described as sensitive in a tone that always sounded like an apology on my parents' behalf. I adored my brother with the kind of desperate, consuming love that only younger siblings seem capable of. I wanted to be wherever he was. I wanted to do whatever he did. And by the time I was old enough to really understand the world, Theo already had Roman. They'd met in middle school. 2 alphas thrown together in a gym class neither of them wanted to be in, and from that day on it was like watching 2 halves of the same person finally find each other. Roman practically lived at our house. He had his own spot at our dinner table, his own towel in our bathroom, his own key, eventually, when my parents got tired of him knocking. He was an only child with parents who worked constantly, and I think, looking back, our house became something like a second home for him in a way none of us fully appreciated until much later. He needed us as much as we apparently needed him underfoot. I was always the third wheel, the tag-along, the little brother who showed up uninvited and stayed too long. Theo, to his credit, never seemed to mind me much. He had the easy patience of someone who'd never once doubted his place in the world. Who could afford to be generous with his attention because there was always more of it to go around? But Roman was different. Roman guarded his time with Theo like it was something precious and finite, like every minute I stole from their friendship was a minute he'd never get back. I didn't understand it then. I do now, a little. Hindsight has a way of reorganizing memories into shapes that make more sense, of letting you see the things you were too young or too hopeful to notice the first time around. What I noticed at 9, at 12, at 15 was simply this: Roman Charles did not want me around. And because I was an idiot, because I was an omega, who had decided somewhere deep in the part of me that didn't yet have words for things, that Roman Charles was the most fascinating person I had ever encountered, I kept showing up anyway. I remember the summer I was 11, the year everything started to feel different even though nothing had technically changed. Theo and Roman had taken up running together before school started, training for some cross-country thing Theo wanted to try out for, and I used to wake up early just to watch them leave from my bedroom window. I'd press my forehead to the cool glass and watch Roman stretch in our driveway in the gray early light, watch the way his shoulders moved, the easy strength in him even then, the way he and Theo would talk and laugh about nothing in particular while they laced up their shoes. One morning, I worked up the courage to ask if I could come. "You can't even run a mile, Glenn," Roman said, not unkindly, but not gently either. Just stating a fact the way you'd point out that the sky was a particular shade of blue that morning. "You'll slow us down." "I could try," I said. "We don't have time for you to try," he said, already jogging backward away from me toward the end of the driveway, toward Theo, toward the version of the morning that didn't include me. "Go back inside, Nuisance." I went back inside. I sat on the porch steps instead and watched them disappear down the street, and I told myself it didn't matter. The way you tell yourself a lot of things don't matter when you're 11 and desperately, hopelessly trying not to cry over a boy who was 6 years older than you and had never once looked at you like you were anything other than an obstacle. I think that might have been the first time I understood, in some wordless, instinctive way, that what I felt about Roman Charles was not the same as what I felt about anyone else. It wasn't a crush, not yet. I was 11. I didn't have the vocabulary for crushes, especially not on Alpha's 6 years my senior, who'd known me since I was in diapers. But it was something. A pull. An awareness that lived in my chest whenever he was in the room, a hyper-attunement to where he was standing, what he was doing, whether he was looking at me or, more often, looking through me. It only got worse as I got older. Isn't that always how it goes? The things we're supposed to grow out of instead grow roots. By the time I was 14, I had an entire secret language built around Roman Charles that I never spoke aloud to a single living soul. I knew that he took his coffee black, no sugar, because he thought sweetening it was a waste of good coffee. I knew that he hummed under his breath when he was concentrating, completely unaware he was doing it, some tuneless string of notes that meant, "Don't talk to me right now." I knew that he bit the inside of his cheek when he was trying not to laugh at something he thought was funny, but didn't want to admit was funny, usually something Theo had said. I knew the particular cadence of his footsteps on our stairs, knew it well enough to identify him from 2 floors away without ever seeing him. I knew, too, exactly how he smelled. Alphas have a scent the way everyone does, but his was something I'd memorized, the way you memorize. A song you can't stop humming, cedar, and something darker underneath it, something like rain on hot pavement. Something that made my skin feel too tight whenever he passed close enough for me to catch it. I used to think there was something wrong with me. That I noticed these things about him, cataloged them so carefully, the way I never bothered to do with anyone else. I told myself it was just because he was around so much. I told myself a lot of things. He never noticed any of it, of course. Why would he? To Roman Charles, I was Theo's little brother, a fixture of the house he practically lived in, an inconvenience he'd learned to tolerate because tolerating me was the cost of getting to spend time with Theo. He called me Nuisance the way some people call their siblings by an old childhood nickname. automatically, without much thought behind it, a habit worn smooth by years of repetition. I don't think he ever meant it as cruelty. I think, if you'd asked him, he would have been genuinely confused that it ever hurt. But it did hurt. God, it hurt in ways I didn't have any business letting it hurt, given that he was just a teenage alpha being mildly annoyed by his best friend's kid brother, given that none of it was supposed to mean anything. It hurt because I wanted more than I wanted almost anything else in my adolescence for Roman Charles to look at me the way he looked at Theo, like I was someone worth his attention, worth his time, worth the trouble of being known. I remember the day I presented, the day everything about my body decided to confirm what my parents and the doctors had already suspected since I was a child. Too small and too soft-faced to be anything but an omega. I was 16. It happened during the worst possible week of my life, 2 days before final exams. And I spent 4 days in a haze of fever and confusion and an ache so deep in my bones I thought something inside me was breaking. Theo took care of me mostly. He missed 2 days of his own classes to sit outside my door because I'd locked it and wouldn't let anyone in, not even him, mortified in some animal way I couldn't explain even to myself. My mother brought soup I couldn't eat. My father hovered at the edges of everything, the way alpha fathers of omega sons often do, unsure of his role in a process that belonged so entirely to my body and not at all to his. Roman came by on the 3rd day. I didn't see him. I smelled him, though, caught it even through my closed door, even through the fog of my own fever scent, that cedar and rain on pavement that I'd know anywhere. And something in my chest had clenched so hard I'd had to bite down on my own wrist to keep from making a sound. I heard him talking to Theo in the hallway, low voices I couldn't quite make out, and then I heard him leave. And the disappointment that flooded through me was so sharp and so unreasonable that I cried about it for an hour after furious at myself the entire time. He hadn't asked to see me. Why would he have? I was just Theo's little brother, presenting for the first time, an event that had absolutely nothing to do with him. I found out later, much later, that he brought soup from someplace across town that Theo had mentioned. I liked, dropped it off, and left without coming inside because, according to Theo, who told me this years afterward, almost as an afterthought, never realizing what it would do to me to hear it, Roman said it wasn't really his place to be hovering around while you were going through something like that, said it felt wrong. He's weirdly old-fashioned about that stuff. I didn't know what to do with that information then. I still don't, fully, except that it sits in me now like a stone I keep turning over, looking for the shape of something I might have missed. After I presented, things between Roman and me didn't get better. If anything, they got stranger, more charged in a way I couldn't articulate at the time. He started keeping a more deliberate distance, not unkind, never unkind, but careful in a way he hadn't been before, like I was something fragile now instead of something irritating. He stopped ruffling my hair when he came over, a habit he'd had since I was small. He started knocking before he walked into rooms I was in, even rooms in my own house. He stopped calling me Nuisance for a while, and I remember being perversely upset about that too, because at least nuisance had been a word that meant he was thinking about me at all. I asked Theo about it once, fishing in the clumsy way 16-year-olds fish for information they're too embarrassed to ask for directly. Roman's being weird, I said, picking at the frayed edge of my sleeve, not looking at my brother. Did I do something? Theo had laughed, not unkindly, and ruffled my hair the way Roman no longer did. He's just being respectful, idiot. You presented. You're an omega now. Some alphas get weird about boundaries after that, especially the old-fashioned ones. He probably doesn't want to make you uncomfortable. I'm not uncomfortable, I'd said too quickly, too defensively, and Theo had given me a look I didn't understand then and only half understand now, something assessing. Something that might have been the first flicker of an older brother's suspicion that something he didn't yet have words for was happening underneath the surface of his house. Okay, he'd said slowly. I'll tell him to lighten up then. He must have, because the careful distance softened after that, though it never fully disappeared. Roman started talking to me more. Not much, not the easy, effortless way he talked to Theo, but more than before. He'd ask me how school was going. He'd make fun of the books I was reading, Always paperback fantasy novels with dragons on the covers that he claimed, with the particular superiority of someone who'd never read a fantasy novel in his life, were for children. He still called me Nuisance sometimes, but it had changed texture, somehow softened at the edges, less a dismissal and more something closer to fondness disguised as irritation. Though I told myself I was imagining that. Told myself I was reading meaning into nothing because I wanted there to be meaning so badly. The year I turned 17, Roman got into a state university 4 hours away, and I remember the night before he left sitting on our back porch with Theo. The two of them passing a bottle of something they thought I didn't know they'd stolen from my father's liquor cabinet, laughing about nothing, about everything, about every shared joke from a decade of friendship that I'd spent my whole life standing just outside the edges of. I sat on the steps below them, knees pulled to my chest, listening, the way I always had, the way I always would, apparently, for the rest of my life if things didn't change. At some point, Theo went inside to find food, leaving Roman and me alone on the porch for the first time I could remember in years. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. The crickets were loud. The bottle sat between us, mostly empty. Quick pause here. If you want to watch our videos early with 0 ads or get access to exclusive videos, our Patreon has you covered. Link in the description. Alright, back to where things get interesting. You're going to miss having someone to torment, I finally said. Trying for light, trying for easy, the way Theo always managed to sound, even when he wasn't trying. Roman was quiet for a second. When he spoke, his voice had a different quality to it than I was used to. Something less guarded. Maybe because of the alcohol. Maybe because he knew he was leaving, and the leaving made him careless with things he usually kept locked down. "You're not so bad anymore, you know," he said, looking out at the dark yard instead of at me. "When you were a kid, you were exhausting. Always underfoot, always wanting something." He paused. "You grew out of it mostly? It wasn't much. It wasn't anything, really, by any reasonable standard. A backhanded, almost compliment from a 19-year-old who'd had too much of my father's bourbon. But I held on to it for years. You're not so bad anymore." I turned it over and over the way I'd turned over Nuisance all those years before. Except this time, the edges weren't sharp. This time it felt like something I could keep. "Thanks," I said, my voice doing something embarrassing, something I hoped the dark hid. "I think." He'd looked at me then, really looked, in a way he hadn't in years, maybe ever. Like he was seeing something he hadn't expected to find, some shift in the landscape of me he hadn't accounted for. I remember my heart going so loud in my ears, I was sure he could hear it. I remember thinking, with the particular clarity that sometimes comes right before you do something stupid, that if he leaned even an inch closer, I would have done something I couldn't take back. He didn't lean closer. Theo came back outside with a bag of chips, and the moment broke apart like it had never existed at all, and the next morning Roman left for college, and I didn't see him again for almost a year. I want to say that distance fixed me. I want to say that I spent that year doing normal 17-year-old things, going to dances, kissing people my own age, falling for someone appropriate and available, and not impossibly tangled up with my own brother's entire life. I did some of that, actually. I went to a dance with a boy from my chemistry class, who smelled like nothing in particular, who held my hand at the right moments, and said the right things, and the whole time, some small, traitorous part of my brain was comparing the dull, comfortable nothing I felt for him to the way my pulse used to stumble whenever Roman Charles walked into a room, and finding the comparison unbearable. I went to college myself 2 years after that, partly because it was time, partly because I genuinely wanted to study what I was studying, and partly, I can admit this now, 4 years and a lot of distance later, because I needed to get away from a house that still smelled like him sometimes, from a brother whose best friend had somehow become the architect of half my adolescent heartbreak without ever knowing it. I didn't see Roman much during those years. He and Theo stayed close, closer than ever really, once Roman moved back to our city after graduating, and the two of them started working together at the firm Theo's mentor had helped him get into. I'd hear about Roman secondhand, mostly, in the texts Theo sent me. The occasional video call where Roman's voice would carry from another room and something in my chest would clench, traitorous and immediate, even 3 states away. I told myself it would fade. I told myself that's what time was for, that eventually I'd think of Roman Charles and feel nothing but the dull, distant fondness you feel for anyone from your childhood, a person who used to matter and no longer did. It didn't fade. If anything, the absence made it worse. Let it grow into something bigger and stranger in the dark, the way things do when you don't let any light touch them. By the time I was 20, by the time I'd finished my second year of college and decided to come home for the summer before my internship started, I had built an entire architecture of feeling around a man I hadn't seen in 18 months. A man who, as far as I knew, still thought of me as the kid who used to hold up half-drowned frogs and ruin his afternoons. I told myself the trip home would be fine. I told myself I was an adult now, that I could be in the same room as Roman Charles without my whole nervous system rearranging itself around him. I told myself a lot of things on that drive home. 3 hours of highway and bad radio and a steadily climbing dread that had nothing to do with my actual destination and everything to do with the possibility, the likelihood. Given how close he and Theo had become, that Roman would be there too. I should have known better. I should have called ahead. I should have done anything other than walk through my own brother's front door at 9 in the morning exhausted from the drive here. A mess wearing the most unflattering sweatpants I owned. Completely unprepared for the sight of Roman Charles standing in Theo's kitchen in one of Theo's old t-shirts, looking like every single thing I had spent 2 years trying very hard to stop wanting. He'd grown into himself in a way that should have been illegal. The lanky, sharp-edged teenager I remembered had filled out into something broader, steadier, more sure of the space he occupied. His hair was a little longer than I remembered, pushed back from his face in a way that made him look older, more settled. More like the kind of man who'd stopped being surprised by his own life and started simply living it. He had a coffee mug in his hand, steam still curling off the top, and when he looked up and saw me standing in the doorway with my duffel bag over one shoulder and my mouth slightly open, something crossed his face that I couldn't name. For one suspended, terrifying second, neither of us said a single word. "Glenn," he finally said, and my name in his mouth did something to my chest I wasn't prepared for, something that had nothing to do with the 11 years of nuisance that had come before it. His voice had dropped lower somewhere in the years I'd missed, gone rougher around the edges. He stopped, started again. "You're here." "I'm here," I said, because apparently that was the best my brain could manage standing in my brother's kitchen. Every cell in my body suddenly and acutely aware of him in a way that felt less like a memory and more like a verdict. Theo's voice came from somewhere down the hall, bright and oblivious. "Is that Glenn?" "Finally." "Roman, get him some coffee. The kid's been driving since dawn." Roman didn't move for a second. He just looked at me, that unreadable expression still sitting on his face like something he hadn't decided how to feel yet, and I had the distinct, dizzying sensation of standing at the edge of something I didn't have a map for. "Yeah," he said finally, setting his mug down, reaching for another from the cabinet without breaking eye contact. "Coffee. Right." I didn't know it yet, standing there in that kitchen with my heart hammering and my whole carefully constructed sense of having moved on, collapsing in real time. But that morning was the beginning of the unraveling of 11 years of careful, comfortable distance. I didn't know that Roman Charles had spent those same 18 months I'd been gone thinking about me more than either of us would have admitted out loud. I didn't know that the word nuisance had quietly, secretly, somewhere in the years I wasn't watching, stopped being the only word he had for me. I only knew that his hand shook just slightly when he passed me the mug, and that he pulled his fingers back from mine. Half a second faster than he needed to, like contact between us was something dangerous now. Something he wasn't sure either of us could survive. That summer was supposed to last 6 weeks before my internship started. I'd planned it carefully back in my dorm room, 3 states away. mapping out exactly how much time I'd spend with my parents, how much time decompressing before the next chapter of my life began. I hadn't planned for Roman, I should have. In hindsight, it seems almost willfully naive that I didn't account for the fact that Roman Charles, having moved back to our city and joined the firm with Theo, would now be a near-permanent fixture of my brother's life, in a way he hadn't been since we were teenagers. Not just a friend who came around occasionally, but someone who showed up for dinner 3 nights a week, who had a key to Theo's apartment the same way he'd once had a key to our parents' house, who occupied space in my brother's daily life so completely that avoiding him would have meant avoiding Theo too. I didn't want to avoid Theo. God help me. I didn't really want to avoid Roman either, not when it came down to it, not when the alternative was going back to a life where I only thought about him in the abstract in memory, in the safe distance of 3 states and however many months. The second night I was home, Theo insisted on a dinner, a proper one, not takeout. I'm an adult now, Glenn, I can cook, and invited Roman without. I suspected giving the decision a single second of consideration. Because to Theo, of course, Roman would be there. Roman was always there. Roman had been a fixture of every family dinner of my childhood, and apparently nothing about that had changed just because I'd spent 2 years building a careful, fragile peace with my own feelings 3 states away. I almost didn't go. I stood in front of the mirror in my old childhood bedroom. My parents had kept it mostly the same posters and all a small mercy and a small horror in equal measure, and considered, seriously considered, texting Theo some excuse about a headache. But that felt like exactly the kind of cowardice I'd promised myself I'd grown out of. So I went wearing a shirt I'd packed without thinking too hard about why I'd packed it, and told myself again that I could be a normal person around Roman Charles. I was not a normal person around Roman Charles. He'd brought wine, the kind with a cork instead of a screw cap, the kind that signaled he'd put some thought into the gesture, even if the gesture itself was just a casual nod to Theo's attempt at adulthood. He was sitting at Theo's small kitchen table when I walked in, sleeves rolled to his elbows, laughing at something on his phone, and the sight of him there, comfortable, golden in the evening light coming through Theo's window, looking like he belonged exactly where he was sitting, did something complicated and painful to my chest. "There he is," Theo said from the stove, gesturing at me with the wooden spoon like I was a guest of honor. Sit, Roman, pour him some wine." "He's 20, Roman said, not looking up from his phone immediately. "Is that legal?" "It's my apartment," Theo said. "I make the laws here." Roman did look up then, and something flickered across his face when his eyes found mine, gone too fast for me to read it properly, but they're undeniably there. The same unreadable thing I'd caught in the kitchen 2 days before. He reached for the bottle anyway, poured a glass, slid it across the table toward me without quite meeting my eyes. "Don't tell your parents," he said, the corner of his mouth doing something that wasn't quite a smile, but lived in the same neighborhood as one. "I'm 20, not 12, I said, sliding into the chair across from him, because it was the only open seat, because some part of me wanted to be close enough to catch his scent, even though I knew exactly what that scent would do to me. I think I can keep a secret." "Can you, though?" Roman said, and there was something in his voice, teasing almost, lighter than I remembered him ever being with me, that caught me so off guard I nearly knocked over my glass reaching for it. "As I recall, you told my entire family I'd kissed Sarah Whitfield behind the gym in 10th grade, approximately 4 minutes after I told you not to tell anyone." "That was 8 years ago," I said, flushing despite myself. Despite the years, despite everything. I was 12. I didn't understand the concept of secrets. "You understood it fine when it was your own secrets," he said. "You just decided mine weren't worth keeping. Your secrets were boring," I said, which wasn't even true, which was the opposite of true. Because every secret Roman Charles had ever let slip in front of me, every fragment of him I'd ever managed to collect, had felt to me like something precious enough to be hoarded, not betrayed. He laughed at that, actually laughed, a real one, head tipping back slightly, and the sound of it did something to my whole chest cavity that I had no business letting happen at my own brother's dinner table. Theo glanced over from the stove with an expression I couldn't quite parse, something curious, something filing information away for later, but neither of us noticed at the time. Too caught up in whatever strange new current had opened up between us. Dinner went on like that, easier than I'd expected, easier than any interaction with Roman had been in years. Like something between us had shifted in the time I'd been gone, and neither of us had quite caught up to the new shape of it yet. He asked about my classes, actually listened to the answers instead of letting his eyes glaze over the way I remembered from when I was younger. He argued with me about a book I was reading. He'd apparently started reading the fantasy novels he used to mock a fact he revealed almost sheepishly, like it cost him something to admit. And the argument went on for 20 minutes long after Theo had given up trying to follow it and started scrolling through his phone instead. "You're wrong," I told him at one point, gesturing with my fork for emphasis. "The whole point of that ending is that it's supposed to be unsatisfying. That's the theme, you can't have it both ways." "I can have whatever opinion I want," Roman said, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, watching me with an expression that made my skin feel several sizes too small. "It's a free country." "That's not an argument." "It's the only argument I need." I remember laughing. Really laughing, the kind that comes from somewhere low and unguarded, and catching the way Roman's eyes tracked the sound. Something soft and startled crossing his face before he looked away. Back down at his wine glass like he'd caught himself doing something he hadn't meant to do. It was a small thing. It shouldn't have meant anything. But I held on to it the way I'd held on to "You're not so bad anymore" years before, turning it over in my hands, long after the dinner ended, long after Roman had said his goodbyes. A brief, almost careful hug that lasted half a second longer than it needed, to his hand splayed warm against my back. His scent enveloping me so completely, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from making a sound, long after I'd gone home to my parents' house and lain awake in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to talk myself out of a hope I had no business entertaining. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm I hadn't expected and didn't know how to resist. Theo's dinners became a near-nightly thing once he realized I wasn't leaving for another month, and Roman was at almost all of them. And somewhere in the accumulation of those evenings, wine and arguments about books, and Theo falling asleep on the couch halfway through movies, leaving Roman and me alone in the quiet, talking in low voices about nothing and everything. Something between us kept shifting, kept rearranging itself into a shape I didn't have a name for yet, but recognized somewhere deep in my chest as something I'd been wanting my entire life. He started texting me. Just small things at first. A photo of a dog he'd seen on his walk that he thought I'd like, a meme referencing one of our book arguments. A question about whether I wanted to grab coffee sometime while Theo was stuck at work. Small things that built, slowly, into something that felt less like the careful distance of a man tolerating his best friend's little brother and more like the early architecture of something neither of us was saying out loud. I caught him looking at me sometimes, across rooms, across tables, in the particular unguarded moment right before he realized I'd noticed and looked away. I caught myself doing the same thing more than once, my whole body angled toward him in a room before my brain had even registered. I was doing it. Like some instinct older than thought, had already decided where I belonged. And then there was the night of Theo's birthday, 3 weeks into that summer. The night everything almost broke open and didn't, not yet. Not for a few more aching weeks. The night I learned, in the worst possible way, exactly how much Roman Charles had been thinking about me, and exactly how hard he'd been trying to make sure I never found out. Theo's birthday party was loud, crowded with people from the firm and old friends from college, the kind of gathering my brother loved and I usually endured rather than enjoyed. I'd dressed carefully that night, more carefully than I wanted to admit to myself, and told myself it had nothing to do with the possibility that Roman would be there, even though I knew with absolute certainty that he would be. He was there within the first 20 minutes, and he looked as he always seemed to look that summer, like something I didn't have any business wanting as badly as I did. Dark shirt sleeves, pushed up that easy. Settled confidence he carried, now that he hadn't had as a teenager, the kind of presence that made a room reorganize itself around him without him ever seeming to notice it was happening. I spent most of the early party orbiting around the edges of conversations, the way I usually did at gatherings like this, more comfortable watching than participating. I noticed, though, I always noticed where Roman was concerned, the way his eyes found me periodically across the room. The way he'd lose the thread of whatever conversation he was in for half a second whenever I moved somewhere new. It was a man named Adrian who changed the shape of the evening. He was a co-worker of Theo's, an alpha a few years older than me, charming in the practiced way of someone who knew exactly how charming he was. And he found me by the drinks table sometime around 10 and decided, apparently, that I was worth his attention for the rest of the night. I didn't mind at first. It was nice, in a small, uncomplicated way, to be looked at by someone who wasn't tangled up in 11 years of complicated history. Someone who smiled at me like I was simply a person worth smiling at rather than a puzzle he hadn't decided how to solve. Adrian was easy to talk to. He laughed at the right moments. He stood close enough that anyone watching would have understood exactly what kind of conversation we were having, the kind with a destination in mind. I don't think I noticed Roman watching us until Theo mentioned it later, half amused, half something else I couldn't place. But I noticed the shift in the air around 11, when Adrian's hand found my arm light casual, the kind of touch that asks a question without using words. And a presence appeared at my other side so abruptly, I nearly spilled my drink. "Glenn," Roman said, and his voice had a quality to it I'd never heard directed at me before, low, edged with something he wasn't quite managing to keep out of it. "Theo's looking for you. Something about the cake." It wasn't true. I found that out 20 minutes later when Theo, very much not looking for me, asked where I'd disappeared to. But in the moment, I didn't question it. I excused myself from Adrian, who looked mildly disappointed but recovered quickly enough, already scanning the room for his next conversation, and followed Roman out onto the back patio where the noise of the party dropped to a low hum behind the glass door. "What's going on with the cake?" I asked, because apparently my brain still hadn't caught up to the strange tension radiating off him. "There's no cake thing," Roman said, jaw tight, looking out at the dark yard instead of at me. His hands shoved into his pockets in a way that looked deliberate, like he didn't trust them to stay there on their own. "I made it up." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched long enough that I started to feel something nervous and electric building in my chest, the same feeling I'd had on that porch 3 years ago, right before he left for college. Right before nothing happened and everything almost did. "That guy," Roman finally said, voice tight. "Adrian, he's not—" He stopped. Started again, jaw working like the words were costing him something. "He's not good for you." "You don't know anything about him," I said, even though I didn't really know anything about him either, even though the observation felt beside the point, felt like it was circling something neither of us was saying directly. "I know enough," Roman said. "I know he slept with half the office. I know he doesn't stick around." "Maybe I don't want him to stick around," I said. And I don't fully know why I said it, except that something reckless had opened up in my chest. Some need to see what would happen if I pushed at this thing between us instead of carefully tiptoeing around it the way I had for 11 years. Maybe I just wanted to talk to someone tonight who actually looks at me like I'm— I stopped myself before I could say the rest of that sentence. Before I could say something I wasn't ready to say out loud, something about wanting to be looked at finally after years of being looked through. Roman's eyes found mine then, and whatever was sitting behind them in that moment was sharper, more exposed than anything I'd seen on his face before. Not anger exactly, though there was something close to it underneath, but something else. Something that looked almost like fear, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff he'd spent a very long time pretending wasn't there. "Like you're what, Glenn?" he said, and his voice had dropped lower, rougher, closer to me now than I'd registered him moving close enough that I could smell him properly. Cedar and rain and something underneath that I'd never been able to name, something that made my whole body feel like it was leaning toward him without my permission. I don't know, I said, which was a lie, which was the biggest lie I'd told in years, because I knew exactly what I wanted. Had known it since I was 11 years old, standing at my bedroom window, watching him stretch in our driveway in the gray morning light. Like I'm someone you actually want around. Something cracked open in his expression then, something raw and unguarded that I'd never seen on him before. Not in 11 years, not even that night on the porch before he left for college. For one suspended second, I thought he was going to close the distance between us entirely. I felt the air shift, felt the gravity of him pulling at me, felt my own body already starting to move toward whatever was about to happen. Then the patio door slid open behind us, and Theo's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "There you two are!" "Glenn, your mom's been texting. She wants to know if you're staying over or coming home tonight." Roman stepped back so fast it looked almost violent, putting careful, deliberate distance between us, his expression shuddering closed in real time like he was slamming a door I'd only just glimpsed through. "We were just talking," he said, voice gone flat and controlled again, nothing like the rough, exposed thing it had been seconds before. "I should get back inside." He left without looking at me again. I stood on that patio for a long moment after he'd gone, my heart slamming against my ribs. Theo looking at me with an expression of mild confusion that I didn't have the energy to address, trying to make sense of what had almost happened, what had been sitting underneath 11 years of Nuisance hiding in plain sight the entire time. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my childhood bed staring at the same ceiling I'd stared at 1,000 times growing up, replaying his voice. "Like you're what, Glenn?" Over and over, trying to figure out what had been underneath it. What he'd been about to say or do before. Theo interrupted what it meant that an alpha who'd spent 11 years calling me an inconvenience had looked at me like that, had sounded like that. Had stepped between me and another man with a jealousy he hadn't even tried very hard to hide. I texted him around 2 in the morning, deleted it before sending, tried again around 3, deleted that one too. By 4, exhausted and raw and too tired to keep pretending I had any dignity left to protect, I finally sent something simple. "Can we talk?" He didn't respond until almost noon the next day, and when he did, it wasn't the answer I was hoping for. "Sorry," the text read. "I was out of line last night. Adrian's fine. None of my business who you talk to. Forget I said anything." I read that message probably 30 times over the course of the afternoon, trying to find some hidden meaning in it, some crack I could work my fingers into, and finding nothing but a closed door dressed up as politeness. He was pulling back. Whatever had almost happened on that patio, whatever I'd glimpsed in his eyes for that one unguarded second, he'd apparently decided it was a mistake, something to be apologized for and buried. And the worst part, the part that kept me curled up on my childhood bed for most of that afternoon, throat-tight, eyes burning, was that some traitorous part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, if I'd built an entire fantasy out of one ambiguous moment because I'd wanted it so badly, I'd convinced myself it was real. I didn't see him again for almost 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were some of the longest of my life. Longer even than the 18 months I'd spent 3 states away pretending I didn't think about him constantly. I went through the motions of the rest of my summer, helped my mother in the garden, had lunch with old high school friends who'd also come home for the season. Started packing for the move to the city where my internship would begin in a few weeks. But underneath all of it sat a low, constant ache that I recognized with growing dread as something far more serious than a passing infatuation. Theo noticed something was wrong, of course. He always noticed, even when he pretended not to. Even when he gave me the space to work through things on my own, the way older brothers sometimes instinctively know to do. "You and Roman fighting about something?" he asked one evening, the two of us sitting on our parents' back porch, a pale echo of countless evenings from our childhood. He's been weird too. Distracted. Keeps almost saying something and then not saying it. My heart did something complicated at that. "What do you mean?" Theo shrugged, picking at the label of his beer bottle. "I don't know. He asked me last week if I thought you were happy. Like, genuinely happy, with your life, with where things are headed. Weird thing to randomly ask about your best friend's little brother, right? He glanced over at me, something curious in his expression. Unless it's not that weird. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, which was, by that point, the most consistent lie of my entire life. Theo didn't push, which was its own kind of mercy. But he gave me a look before he let the subject drop, the kind of look that told me he'd filed the conversation away somewhere. That he wasn't done thinking about it even if he wasn't ready to say whatever conclusion he was circling. I almost reached out to Roman a dozen times during those 2 weeks. I drafted messages I never sent, dialed his number, and hung up before it could connect. Stood outside the coffee shop near the firm one afternoon for almost 10 minutes, trying to work up the courage to go in, knowing he'd likely be there before walking away without doing it. The fear wasn't really about rejection, not exactly. It was about the possibility that I'd misread everything, that the version of him I'd glimpsed on that patio had been a trick of wine and bad lighting and 11 years of wanting something so badly I'd hallucinated it into existence. The reunion, when it finally came, wasn't anything I orchestrated. It came on an ordinary Thursday evening 2 weeks after the party, when I was at Theo's apartment helping him assemble a bookshelf he'd bought and immediately regretted buying, surrounded by cardboard and tiny plastic bags of screws. When Theo's phone rang and he disappeared into the other room to take what turned out to be an urgent work call that pulled him out of the apartment entirely, leaving me alone with an unfinished bookshelf and instructions in a language that bore no resemblance to actual English. I was still wrestling with a particularly uncooperative shelf panel 20 minutes later when I heard a key turn in the lock and looked up to find Roman standing in the doorway, keys still in hand, looking as startled to see me as I was to see him. Theo said he needed help with this, he said, gesturing vaguely at the bookshelf chaos around me, his voice careful, neutral, the voice of someone determined not to repeat whatever mistake he believed he'd made 2 weeks earlier. He didn't mention you'd be here. He's on a call, I said. Some work emergency. He left like 20 minutes ago. For a moment, neither of us moved. The apartment felt very small and very quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that presses against your chest. I watched something war across Roman's face, the part of him that wanted clearly to make some excuse and leave, and some other part that won out eventually. When he set his keys down on the counter and crossed the room to crouch beside me, picking up the instructions I'd abandoned. "You're holding that backward," he said, taking the shelf panel out of my hands, his fingers brushing mine in a way that sent something sharp and electric up my arm. "It goes the other way." We worked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that felt less like the absence of words and more like the accumulation of every word neither of us was saying. I was hyper-aware of him the entire time, the warmth radiating off him in the small space, the particular concentration on his face when he was working through a problem, the way his hands moved with a quiet competence that did something unfair to my ability to think clearly. "I'm sorry about the text," he finally said, not looking up from the screw he was tightening. "The one after the party." My pulse stumbled. "Which part of it?" "All of it." He set the screwdriver down, finally looking at me, and there was something different in his face now than there had been in his careful closed-off text 2 weeks before, something that looked almost like exhaustion. Like a man who'd spent 2 weeks fighting a battle he'd finally decided he didn't have the strength to keep fighting. I lied. When I said it was none of my business who you talked to, I lied because the alternative was telling you the truth, and I didn't think you'd want to hear it. My chest felt very tight. "What's the truth?" He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working, his eyes searching my face like he was looking for permission, or maybe looking for an escape route, some sign that he should stop before he started. "Do you remember," he said slowly, "when you were 9 and you held up that frog like it was the greatest thing you'd ever found?" "You called me a nuisance," I said, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. "I did," he said. "I called you a nuisance for 11 years, Glenn. Do you know why?" I shook my head, though some traitorous, hopeful part of me was already starting to guess. "Because I didn't have any other word for it," he said, and his voice had gone quiet, almost rough, The kind of quiet that comes from someone admitting something they've never said out loud before. I was 15 years old, and I noticed you in a way I had absolutely no business noticing my best friend's 9-year-old little brother, and it scared the hell out of me. And the only thing I knew how to do with that fear was push you away and call it annoyance. It was easier to be irritated by you than to sit with whatever the actual feeling was. So I kept doing it. Every year it got a little more complicated, and every year I got a little better at hiding behind the same stupid word, because the alternative was admitting that somewhere along the way, watching you grow up had become the thing I looked forward to most about coming over to your house. I couldn't speak. I sat there on Theo's living room floor, surrounded by cardboard and loose screws, staring at Roman Charles like he'd just rearranged the entire architecture of my understanding of the world. My heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. When you presented, he continued, like he'd opened some door inside himself and couldn't stop now that he'd started, I panicked. I didn't know what to do with the fact that the kid I'd been quietly, stupidly fond of for years had suddenly become someone I couldn't be around without every instinct in my body screaming at me that something had changed, that you weren't a kid anymore. That the thing I'd been pretending was just irritation had never been irritation at all. I kept my distance because I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't. I told myself it was respect. Some of it was. Most of it was fear. Roman, I started, but he wasn't finished, like he'd been holding this for so long that now that the dam had broken, everything was coming out at once. You went to college, and I told myself that was good, that distance would fix it, that I'd stop thinking about you constantly, once you weren't around to remind me every 5 minutes that I was in love with someone I had absolutely no right to be in love with. His voice cracked slightly on the word love, like it had cost him everything to say it out loud. It didn't fix anything. I thought about you every single day you were gone. I'd see something, a book, a dumb meme, a dog on the street, and the first thought in my head was always, you'd like this, I should tell Glenn. I didn't most of the time. I told myself it wasn't my place. And then I came home, I said, finally finding my voice, barely above a whisper. And then you came home, he agreed. And you walked into Theo's kitchen looking like every year I'd missed had only made things worse, and I knew within about 30 seconds that I was in serious trouble. And then that night at the party, with that guy's hand on your arm, something in me just... He stopped, shook his head. I've never been jealous of anything in my life the way I was jealous of him having permission to touch you that I didn't think I had. You could have just said something, I said, my voice thick, instead of pulling away. Instead of 2 weeks of nothing. I was scared, he said simply, the admission costing him something visible, some crack in the careful control he'd held onto for over a decade. I've spent 11 years calling you a nuisance to avoid admitting what you actually were to me, Glenn. Do you have any idea how hard it is to undo that? To finally say the thing out loud and risk you looking at me like I'm something broken, something wrong, after I spent your entire childhood making sure you never knew? I'm not going to look at you like that, I said. And I could feel tears building behind my eyes, hot and overwhelming. 11 years of wanting finally cracking open into something I didn't have any defense against. Roman, I've been in love with you since I was 11 years old, standing at my window, watching you stretch in our driveway. I have spent 11 years wanting you to look at me like I was something other than an inconvenience. You have no idea. You cannot possibly understand what it does to me to hear you say any of this. Something broke open in his face. Then something that looked like relief and disbelief and hope, all tangled together, and he reached out slowly like he was giving me every chance to pull away. And brushed his thumb along my jaw, his hand trembling slightly with the weight of finally being allowed to touch me like this. 11 years old, he repeated, voice rough, almost wondering. God, Glenn. I called you a nuisance for 11 years, and the entire time you were. In love with you, I finished for him, yes. I don't deserve that, he said, but he was leaning closer now, close enough that I could feel his breath against my mouth, close enough that the cedar and rain scent of him was overwhelming every other sense I had. I spent over a decade making you feel like an afterthought. You're going to spend the rest of it making up for it, I said. And the words came out steadier than I felt, steadier than I had any right to feel, with my whole body trembling. Every nerve ending alight with the proximity of him. Is that a promise? He asked, and there was something almost playful underneath the rawness of his voice now, something that sounded, for the first time in 11 years, like a man who'd finally stopped fighting the thing he wanted most. It's a demand, I said. He kissed me then finally, after 11 years of careful distance and misnamed irritation and a childhood spent on opposite sides of a door neither of us had known how to open. Kissed me slow and certain. One hand cradling the back of my neck like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't hold on tightly enough, the other still trembling slightly against my jaw. It felt like every single thing I had spent over a decade hoping for, and never quite letting myself believe could be real, and when he finally pulled back just far enough to rest his forehead against mine. Both of us breathing unsteadily, he laughed. A real laugh, shaky and disbelieving and warm. I am never calling you a nuisance again, he said. Good, I said. Took you long enough. We were still sitting there on the floor, foreheads together, my hands fisted in the front of his shirt like I was afraid letting go would somehow undo everything that had just happened. When we heard Theo's key in the lock, we sprang apart with all the grace of two people who'd just been caught doing exactly what we'd just been doing. And I have never in my life seen Roman Charles look so thoroughly unsettled as he did in the half-second before Theo walked through the door, his face still flushed. His hair slightly mussed from where my fingers had been. Theo took one look at the two of us, me breathless sitting in the wreckage of an unfinished bookshelf, Roman crouched beside me, looking like a man who'd just had his entire worldview rearranged, and stopped dead in the doorway. Okay, he said slowly, gaze moving between us with dawning, almost theatrical comprehension. Okay, so, that's a thing now. Theo, Roman started, already rising to his feet, some old instinct toward damage control kicking in even now, even after everything. Don't, Theo said, holding up a hand, though there was no real anger in it, just something between amusement and exasperation. The expression of a man who'd apparently been waiting a long time for a conversation he hadn't realized he was waiting for. I've watched you two dance around each other for actual years. You asked me last month if I thought Glenn was happy. You've been weird and distracted and grumpy for 2 straight weeks. I'm not stupid, Roman. I was just being polite about not saying anything. He looked at me, something softening in his expression. And you. You've had a face on you since you got home that I haven't seen since you were 16 and had a crush on that kid from your chemistry class. I just didn't put it together that it was him until right now, watching you both look like you got caught with your hand in the cookie jar. You're not upset? I asked, my voice smaller than I meant it to be, because some part of me, some scared, 11-year-old part of me that had spent a lifetime being the unwanted third wheel, had been bracing for exactly this conversation to go badly, had been afraid that even if Roman wanted me, my own brother wouldn't be able to look at us without something breaking. Theo crossed the room and pulled me into a hug, the kind he used to give me when we were kids, solid and unhesitating. You're my brother, he said simply, like it was the only thing that mattered, like the rest was just details. And he's basically been my brother too for 20 years. If the two idiots I love most in the world finally figured out how to make each other happy, I'm not going to be upset about it. I'm going to be insufferable about it, probably, for the rest of your lives, but not upset. Over Theo's shoulder, I caught Roman's eyes and the look on his face, relief and disbelief, and something so warm it made my chest ache, told me everything I needed to know about how much that moment meant to him too. A man who'd spent half his life, half belonging to our family, finally being told, in no uncertain terms, that he belonged completely. That was 4 months ago now. I started my internship in the city not long after, but it turned out the city wasn't nearly as far from home as I'd thought. Not when Roman started driving the 2 hours every other weekend without me even having to ask. Not when my apartment slowly filled with small evidence of him, a toothbrush in my bathroom, a hoodie draped over my desk chair, the particular shape of his presence settling into the corners of my life like he'd always belonged there and was simply finally allowed to stay. He still teases me sometimes, the old habit too deeply worn to disappear entirely. But the word nuisance never crosses his lips anymore. Instead, he calls me other things now, quietly, in the dark, in moments that belong only to the two of us. Words I spent 11 years aching to hear and never once let myself believe I would. He tells me sometimes late at night, with his face buried against my neck and his arms locked around me like he's still half convinced I might vanish if he loosens his grip, that he doesn't know how he survived 11 years of loving me from a careful, terrified distance. And I tell him every time that it doesn't matter anymore because we found our way to each other in the end. I think about that 9-year-old boy sometimes, the one holding up a half-drowned frog like a trophy, desperate for the attention of a 15-year-old who didn't have any idea yet what he'd grow up to feel. I think about all the years in between. The careful distance, the misnamed irritation, the word that followed me around like a shadow I couldn't shake. And I think about the man who finally found the courage to tell me the truth sitting on the floor of my brother's apartment, surrounded by cardboard and loose screws. His hands trembling as he touched my face for the first time, like I was something precious instead of something inconvenient. He calls me nuisance one more time, the night he gets down on one knee in our kitchen 2 years later, ring in hand, voice shaking with a different kind of nervousness than I've ever heard from him. "You've been the most beautiful nuisance of my entire life," he says, and I'm laughing and crying at the same time, the way you do when 11 years of longing finally resolve into something whole. I don't want to spend a single day without you being exactly that, my nuisance, forever if you'll have me. "I've been yours since I was 11, I tell him, kneeling down to meet him at eye level, my hands cupping his face the way his once cupped mine on the floor of a half-built bookshelf. I'm not going anywhere now. He kisses me like he's still relearning how lucky he is to be allowed to, and somewhere outside our kitchen window, I swear I can almost hear the ghost of 2 teenage boys laughing on a dock. The splash of pond water, the sound of a frog being released back into the world it came from, the very first, smallest beginning of everything we'd eventually become. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe. Comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.